Hi, welcome to Deep in My Name Doesn't Matter. Let's dive in. Today we want to talk about Amy Carmichael. She's the daughter of a Presbyterian miller and a devout Presbyterian miller who, when Amy was pretty young, moved to a Belfast, Ireland. And in Belfast, he joined a church and he and his family started teaching a Sunday school for what they called shawlies, or millers' kids who didn't wear hats but wore shawls instead. This is a lower income thing, and they started this Sunday school class, and the Sunday school kind of blew up to a big Bible study of 500 plus people. So Amy Carmichael and family moved to start Welcome Evangelical Church in Belfast, and that church kind of sowed the seeds for Amy to become a missionary and to see this gospel ministry grow. So she was teaching Sunday school there, and she went to hear Hudson Taylor speak in 1887. And when she heard Hudson Taylor speak about China Inland Mission, she was sold. She wanted to be part of China Inland Mission, and so she went and joined. They sent her to Manchester. She studies and trains for 2 to 3 years, and at the end of 2 or 3 years, they tell her that because of her health, she is unfit for missionary duty, which was a blow to her, a severe blow. She suffered from something called neuralgia. She suffered from it her whole life, which is a nerve disease that causes severe pain and often puts you out of commission for work. So Amy Carmichael decides, I'm going to go anyway. She goes to Japan basically on a short-term mission trip and gets really, really sick. And on the way home, they stop in India for her healing so that she'll get better. And there's some hospitals there. So she's there recovering, getting better. And she finds her calling in India, looking around going, this is where God has called me to go. And so she comes back and returns to India with another missions organization where she would serve the rest of her life in India. Now, it wasn't all easy going for her. When she got there, she would teach Bible studies from village to village, from place to place, and often with no success at all. Nobody would come. She'd prepare Bible studies. She'd visit with people. She'd do all the things you're supposed to do as a missionary, and there was little to no fruit. Often she would prepare a Bible study, call all the children of a village and say, we're going to do Bible study. We're going to talk about the God who loves you, and we're going to say these things. And the parents would keep their kids home. They didn't trust her. They wouldn't give her attention. She gets a few local converts out of some women that she begins to travel with, and they begin to travel with her. And she's traveling, sharing the gospel, and just almost no fruit for years, almost no evidence of the gospel changing lives or amassing a crowd. There was little to no success, and she often would pray that the Lord would bring people to hear the gospel. Indeed, at one point she's teaching the gospel, and there is a young boy and his sister who have been faithful to come every day that week. And at the end of the week, she is certain that they're going to come, and she finds out that the father was so frustrated with his children going to hear the gospel that he sent the daughter away to live with somebody else, and he beat the son and tied him to a post for 3 days. So the son was essentially abused by his father for accepting the gospel and believing it. Now, she worked very hard and tirelessly for her entire life. In fact, somebody wrote her a letter once and said, can you tell us what missionary work is like? And Amy Carmichael, in a very Amy Carmichael way, wrote back simply this statement: missionary life is simply a chance to die. Missionary life is a chance to die. Now, if that's not so encouraging, she said it's an opportunity for you to surrender your life in ministry to Christ. It is a chance to die with Christ and be made alive. That was the underlying tone of it: a chance to die with Christ and thereby be made alive. So she with very limited success, starts to find success, and she would say that the beginning of her true ministry there, she would recount this story of a girl named Prina who was a temple slave that she helped to escape slavery, and kind of adopted as her own. So Amy Carmichael began to see this evil in Indian society, which was this evil of temple prostitutes and ritual slavery. If you were a poor Hindu family and you wanted the blessing of the God, you could surrender your daughter to slavery in the temple, and that slavery was supposed to bring the God's approval upon your family. And so there were many girls that were being surrendered to slavery at this time, and Amy Carmichael saw this and warred against it. She would literally cover herself, and she would be a spy. She'd cover herself in coffee, she'd dye her hair, she'd wear Indian clothes, and she would go into these temples to try and find where the slaves were, if there were any, because temples were different. One temple had them, another temple didn't. And so she would go into these temples and try to find if there were slaves, and then she'd break them out. And when she broke them out, she'd take them back to her compound, and she would, there was big walled, fenced off compound, and she would say, you can't have these children. They're mine now. They're my daughters. They're my daughters, and I'm going to take care of them. And she would save these girls. So she was asked, people asked the girls that were in her compound, which became known as the Donavar community, they would ask them, why did you come to Amy Carmichael? What drew you to Amy Carmichael? And they would respond, because Amma loved us. Because Amma loved us. It was love that drove us to her, because Amma loved us. Amma is the word for mother. And so they would come to her compound, and they would find a mother who loved them and taught them about the love of Jesus Christ and the love of God, and they would be saved, and everything would change. Now, she traveled from village to village frequently with with a couple of her friends, her converted, believing Indian friends, and she would travel with them. And so great was their love for the gospel and their love for Christ that these women began to take off their jewelry, which was said to be the pride of a woman in India, was her family jewelry. So she would take off this jewelry. They would take off their jewelry to show humility and risk open shame in India. They'd risk open shame because they didn't have any family jewelry to identify themselves, and the only identification they said they needed was that they were identified with the gospel of Jesus Christ. This had a side benefit of the fact that nobody wanted to rob them. So when they went from village to village, they didn't have to worry about being robbed because they didn't have any jewelry to take. So there was nothing for them to steal. Now, in the later days of her life, in her last 2 decades, she fell in I think it's 1931 or so, or 30. She has a fall, and because of her neuralgia, and she severely injures herself, making her mostly bedridden the rest of her life. And as she's in bed, she did not give up doing gospel ministry. In fact, she started writing more and more. Most scholars estimate that she wrote about 35 books, full books, in that time period, not to mention letters and pamphlets and things like that. 35 books, most of which we don't have copies of anymore, but in 20-year period or so, she spends writing books, and she writes about 30, most scholars think somewhere around 35, maybe more than that. And in 1951, she dies at 83 years old in her bed, having given her life to mission work in India. I would commend to you one particular book called If. So if you can find that book, get it, read it, go through it. That's one of the books she used at her Donavar community to develop the discipleship program that she had going on, where people were growing in Christ. Now, there are 3 things I think that we can really learn and marvel at with Amy Carmichael. First was, we as Christians, our fighting against the enemy is done primarily in prayer. Amy Carmichael would bow on her face before the Lord and give him all of her requests. She would present everything before him. So when she was worried about children, she would bow and pray. When she was worried about food, she would bow and pray, and God never failed to meet her needs. She always prayed. Indeed, so great was this conviction of hers that she would never let people know that she had a need. Instead, she would pray and pray for it, and then God would provide, much like George Muller did. So she would spend her life in prayer in this way, fighting with prayer. She even said the most powerful weapon that a Christian is given is the weapon of prayer against the adversary. Second, teach faithfully. From Amy Carmichael, we can learn that teaching faithfully is rewarded by God in a way that no one else can reward. You see lots of people who figure out how to amass a crowd. But the reality is that if they are not teaching the gospel, then there will be no reward for them. Amy Carmichael knew this and held tight to it, so that when she was preaching and teaching and going from village to village, sharing the gospel with children and women, as she was doing this, if no one came, you know what? She continued to do it because she knew that what her calling was to teach people the gospel and see lives be changed. And then finally, I want to remind you that the story of Amy Carmichael tells us that God is faithful and God is the joy of life. When she wrote that lady back and said missionary life is simply a call to die, she meant that missionary life is a call to surrender everything, and it in and of itself is life. You find life in Jesus Christ, and that life is overflowing in the world. So we find our life in Jesus, and that overflows from us into the world, and that is where joy and life and peace and things are found in Christ Jesus alone. So that's Amy Carmichael. Thanks for joining me in the deep end. Take time to breathe today. Now go get to work.